How do you explain when our innovations do the opposite of what we intend? When the things that we build to build us up and bring us closer together actually end up pulling us down and tearing us further apart? A couple of years ago, I really wanted to go to South America. And so I used an amazing platform, you all should try it, to find a great place to stay. I had a wonderful conversation with a host who was there and would say that she would welcome me to her home and make me feel like I was one of the family. Very quickly, I was on a plane, on my way over, I think it was 18 hours later, like endless cups of coffee, so much jet lag, and I finally arrive on the streets in the evening. And because of my terrible grasp of Spanish, I end up completely lost, dragging my suitcases around these old cobblestone streets. And I remember feeling this level of panic rising up because I knew that if I didn't find where I was going to be staying that night, I was pretty much out in the cold. But I rounded a corner and I saw this light that reminded me of some images that the host had sent, like, here's how you find my home. And I remember that there was just this wave of relief that washed over me because I knew I was home. She opened the door and immediately her face fell. She said, "You can't stay." And I said, "Por qué? Why? Why can't I?" And she said, "Because you're black." And in that moment, I felt so rejected and alone and like I just didn't belong. See, Airbnb is not responsible for this host's reaction to the color of my skin, but our innovation, a platform that tries to connect travelers from around the world so that they can belong, somehow has an unintentional effect in that it connects people who otherwise have never connected. And so problems like discrimination come out. And we see these on Twitter, like hashtag Airbnb while black, where black guests share experiences similar to mine, or hashtag Airbnb while trans, or hashtag Airbnb while gay or Muslim. The list goes on. Now, years later, completely disconnected, Airbnb reaches out to me with a job offer. I get a ping in my inbox saying, "Hi, we're looking to create a new team. Would I like to move to San Francisco, join Airbnb, and try and tackle discrimination?" And immediately I thought, this is an amazing company, a dream for a designer. And then I paused for a moment on the actual question. Do I, a black man, want to tackle racism in America? No. In fact, what I thought was, hell no. But because I'm British and we're very polite, what I actually said was, that will be delightful. Thank you. So here I am. My name is Benjamin Evans, and I'm an inclusive design lead at Airbnb. And I am one of the co-leads of a team called the Anti-Discrimination Team. We're trying to ensure that our innovations actually build belonging at scale. And a couple of years ago, I realized that there is something quite wrong with the way that we innovate in companies, in business, and in tech. But before I tell you what that is, I would actually like us to play a very, very quick game. I'm going to count down from 3, and once I get to 1, what I'd love you to do is to stand up. In fact, let's stand up now if you could. It'll take 20 seconds. So I'm going to count down from 3, and I'm going to ask you to turn to someone around you and to give them a compliment. Now, I can immediately hear the tension in the room because we are British and we do not say nice things. But we're going to give it a shot. I promise the discomfort will dissipate. OK, so if you're ready, so 3, 2, 1, go for it. Thank you very much. Now you're being too nice. If everyone, thank you very much, and everyone come back down. Thank you. Grab your seats. Thank you very much for indulging me. One of the reasons that I love that as a small exercise, well, by the way, none of you said anything nice to me, so thanks for that. But one of the reasons that I love that exercise, aside from the fact that I get to watch people with VP and CEO in their names really struggle to say a sentence, is that it uncovers a couple important things. Number one, that we all have bias. From the person you turn to the words that you said, it was all influenced by hundreds of shortcuts, some subconscious decisions that we have made and formed over the course of our life. It's our brain's way of trying to help us navigate a world in which we are just overwhelmed with information. And so we create these shortcuts, and they run in the background, or like in the background of our operating system, just subtly influencing everything we do. And another reason that I love that game is it highlights that we all need to belong. The moment that I said, we're going to play this game, some of you would have had some anxious, okay, what game is it? Am I going to be in it? Childhood comes flashing back of being left outside in the cold. Then when you stood up to give a compliment, I'm sure some people here were worried about, am I going to get a compliment? Is someone going to say something to me? And I'm sure that there are even people here right now who didn't. And they felt that sad feeling because the need to belong is part of what makes us human. So, why are these two things important? Well, it's because in business, every single decision that we make, especially decisions from our bias, has the potential to make people feel like they don't belong. I'll go a little bit deeper with this. Whenever we think about innovating, we often turn to human-centered design. And to anyone who doesn't know, what we do is we seek out a group, we empathize with them to understand their needs, we bring these insights back to our team, where we then ideate solutions as a group. Next step, we then actually implement those solutions, we test, and we build this into a cycle, this cycle of innovation. But the problem that we have with this, with human-centered design, is that nobody says which human we should place at the center. And so what we end up doing is subconsciously we revert to our biases, and we decide that we're actually going to place ourselves, or those who we believe feel or think or act like we do. When we go out into the world to do our user research, we pick familiar places because they're safer, which means we end up within a certain maybe socio-economic group that we're speaking to. When we bring these insights back to our teams and we try and ideate these solutions, often our teams are homogeneous groups. It's just the way it is. We group with like-minded people, which is kind of the enemy of innovation because you don't get the same level of diversity of thought. And then when we test and iterate, the problems that we have is because we have this bias of wanting our ideas to succeed, all too often we can actually wish and will and misinterpret data because we want to succeed more than we actually want to challenge ourselves to grow and be very different. And so this cycle of innovation actually becomes a cycle of exclusion, where we place people who we believe think and feel and act as we do above all of the others. We champion their needs above all else. And the problem is that because human-centered design actually works, well, our businesses do grow. We do build products and services that resonate with one group. But then we don't see the effects until it's often too late. And we end up with algorithms that amplify our bias. We end up with search engines that can reinforce certain stereotypes. Only recently there was a press article about a search engine that if you ran a search for black people, gorillas would show up because the data sets they were trained on were homogeneous. We also end up with platforms that can often leave groups feeling excluded, although these platforms are supposed to bring us closer together. So what's the solution? How do we defeat our bias? Well, we can't. And on that note, I'd like to thank the chairman. No. See, the problem is not that we actually have bias. The problem is that we are unaware of the effects that it has on us as we're making decisions in business and in life. Tony Fadell, who's one of the original creators of the team that created the iPod, said that the first secret of design is noticing. And so what I wanted to give you here today is just a very simple tool that you can use to notice your bias without feeling ashamed of it, and then potentially use that to make more conscious and inclusive decisions in business and in life. The tool is just a question. Who are we missing? That load? There we go. Now, it's a very simple question. In fact, it almost seems overly so. But Kat Holmes, who used to lead inclusive design at Microsoft, said that recognizing exclusion is one of the keys to inclusive design. We try and be more inclusive in business all the time, but often fall quite short because of this fundamental building block, which is we have to recognize who is missing from the table, who is missing in the processes and workflows that we have. Now, I'm going to give a couple of very short examples of how this, recognizing exclusion and who are we missing, has really helped us at Airbnb. The first example is growth. When we started, we were a local startup based in California in America. It's a overwhelmingly English-speaking community of a certain socioeconomic class. But the goal with Airbnb was always to become this global brand. And so how do you bridge that gap? How do you find a way to ensure that this platform that was created actually speaks to people around the world? We realized the exclusion is that we initially created the platform in English. We weren't thinking about anyone else from any other groups, and that's totally natural. That's normal. That is part of our preferences, part of our bias. It's what helped us get to that first product market fit. But above a certain point, that becomes the constraint that stops us growing, because the overwhelming majority of the world does not speak English. And so we needed to include non-English speakers. Now, within our first 5 years of operating, we got to about 350x growth, which is obscene. Today, we're in 190 countries, 65,000 cities, 4 million homes. We've had over 300 million guests who have actually stayed on the platform. But we can trace this back to this localization effort. This has all happened with just 27 languages. 50% of our guests and hosts do not speak the same language when they meet for the first time. And if we look at the early years of our growth, this is the moment that we decided to localize our product with our first couple of languages. Now, of course, there are additional things that went on there. We have talented teams that are innovating, but at the same time, if we're connecting people, we had to find a way to ensure that everyone is able to speak to one another. To this day, this localization effort, combines or is the baseline to all of our global marketing efforts, that we want to be both hyper-local and global at the same time, so that we're speaking to the communities we're in, as well as bringing everyone together across the globe. Now, localization's kind of an obvious thing if you want to grow your company, so maybe let's try a different example, something a little bit more nuanced. Now, as humans, we are adept at navigating boundaries and hurdles. Initially, when the platform was created, it was created for an average, as we do with user personas. You create an average, you build for this group. The problem is, what is average when you're dealing with humans? Like, to be different is to be human. The notion of an average is rooted in some pretty flawed studies, and we've seen that with seatbelts. When they originally created the averages for seatbelts, it didn't account for people who were tall or for infants. And so, when in designing for this average, we weren't really looking at anyone who falls outside of the average. There are over 1 billion people in the world who have some kind of disability. And often when we think of disability, we think of someone whose disability necessitates the need of a wheelchair. But disabilities can be both permanent or temporary, like if you break an arm. They can be visible, like someone who has lost a limb, or they can be invisible, whether you're deaf in some way. And so these individuals have continually had to adapt to a world that is not built for their needs. And so in bringing them into the core of what we do, we can actually find a way to innovate our product for the better of everyone else. A couple of years ago, Michael Sui, who's one of our accessibility leads, noticed that our platform was not accessible. It didn't meet any kind of web standards. And for a platform that is fast growing with millions of users, it's a real challenge to try and go back and retrofit so that we meet web accessibility standards. How do you make that case to leadership that when everything else is screaming and going full blast this way, we're saying, no, slow down, because we need to do things not just quickly, but properly? Well, we realized within this that if we take some of these standards, like content online needs to be perceivable, that it has to be presented in different ways based upon the way that someone perceives the world, that it needs to be operable, so that if someone's navigating the web via a keyboard, they're able to tab their way through content. Well, in looking to solve the needs of these groups who need these kinds of features and functions built into the site, we realize that there are benefits for everyone else who might use our platform. In making the content perceivable, we ended up transforming it into different types of content, so it's more transmutable, so people have more ways to take on what we're trying to share with them. In trying to make sure that it's operable, we had to change the hierarchy of the site, really ensuring that the information hierarchy was really great. And that means that it's more usable. We all scan content when we read. This is a forcing function that ensures the way that we construct our pages and our content is very scannable. In making sure that the content is indexable, well, we actually end up with a lot of back-end benefits. Better indexing from Google, because the content is structured in a way that if it is only read from a screen reader, it makes total sense. And it also ends up being more robust, because if our engineers are being held to this very high AA standard when it comes to web accessibility, it means that the site is more robust as we scale. The internet, there was a quote I heard the other day, which is something like, the internet was built to be accessible, we just keep fucking with it. So, oh, there we go, all right. So we realize that in working with those whose needs lie at these extremes, that lie outside of the quote unquote average, that we're able to create these benefits that are actually better for all. We're able to drive the innovation of our platform by bringing more and more people into the center. And another interesting insight that came out of it was also learning that we should build with, not for. Within the design world, there is often this design savior thing, that I'm going to solve this problem for this group. And it's really quite troublesome, because what it means is that we go out to these groups, whoever they might be, we research with them, and then we take these insights and we build based on those, as opposed to bringing them back with us and building with them. Another example, something that I found really fascinating is the way that just asking the question, who are we missing, can continually, asking it continually throughout all of your processes can really change a culture in very subtle ways. So Jennifer Hum is one of our lead illustrators. Quick question, is there anything I need to do to fix this side? No? All right. So Jennifer Hum is one of our lead illustrators, and she conducted an audit to see what are the ways that we represent our community. Can anyone see, probably not from this side of the room, can anyone over here see a problem with the way that we were representing our users in our illustrative style? We're telling a single story. And the problem with a single story is not that single stories are false, it's that they are incomplete. We all have very unique stories. We all bring something different. And so in telling a single story, we do a disservice to everyone who does not meet that singular narrative. Now, that kicked off a multi-month self-initiated project where she reimagined how we actually present our users across the platform. And she came to a realization that if we're going to represent people, our community, then we should literally reference real people in the illustrations we do. And so she initially started off by looking at photos of actual people, actual guests, and then abstracting out different face shapes. And then evolving that into like different ways of looking at each person, until she had created this new set of ways and this new framework for how we represent a community that is as diverse as ours. All of these different components with different skin tones, with different hands and nose sizes and jaw shapes. And these became our new standards, so that whenever illustration work is being done, all illustrators coming in know that they have to ensure that what they create is representative. They then expanded this further. These are two of my favorite images from our brand. Now, in the bottom left, these are called scenes. And so the bottom right scene is, in essence, a host handing over the keys to a guest. But when you look closely, you see that we've actually got age diversity in that. We've also got diversity of gender within that, and diversity of race within that. And if you look really closely in the bottom right, you can see that this guest has a physical constraint, has a prosthetic leg. Whereas if you look in the top left, here's another scene. It's about communicating with your host. And again, it's only when you look closely you see that the person on the bottom left has a cochlear implant. And if you look up into the top right, you see there's an interracial relationship, and there's also body size diversity within that as well. And it's so incredibly subtle that the majority of people will not see these things when they look at it. They will just see the scene. But to those who are from an underrepresented groups, these images now speak in an entirely different way, and I bet all of us here look at them slightly differently now that we know how much is going on to what is perceived to be a simple scene. Now, asking the question is just the beginning. I don't want to create the impression that you can just storm into boardrooms asking who are we missing, and straight away there is inclusion and diversity at your companies. And indeed, we have been evolving into a set of inclusive design principles over time. There's not enough time to go into a lot of depth with this here, but there is a talk available online that has all of these in depth. One of them is owning your lens. This is about owning and recognizing your bias, that you should identify where assumptions come in, straight up from asking who we're missing, and then you should embrace diverse thinking and create space for these people and these perspectives into your existing teams and workflows. You should champion others, embracing these edge cases or the unaverage, depending on the terminology you prefer, then making the business case for actually solving the needs of those whose needs are different from the average, and then designing for belonging. Doing all of this internally doesn't go all the way. We also need to involve our users and our community within these decisions. And so bringing a sense of transparency for that and being unafraid to challenge this notion that as a user, I should be the center of the world. No, they can be the center or part of the world, but not the center. And so today I just really wanted to give you a simple question to spark awareness of bias without needing to feel shame for having that bias. A simple question that anyone, anywhere can use. You do not need to be a designer for this. And indeed, if we look at the additional workflows, if you're in marketing, at the top of your funnel, you can ask who are we missing. It's a great way to open up that perspective and get a sense that there may be additional customer group segments that you just haven't accounted for. Or even within engineering workflows, later down the funnel and saying, oh, as we engineer this, as we make this a reality, are we doing so in a way that just works for me, the person making it? Or are we doing it in a way that it can be useful for a much wider variety of people? And it's a simple question that really helps ensure our innovations do as we intended them to do. And as a final thought within this, that really only occurred to me as I was thinking about how to write a speech for this. Because we're talking about this notion of innovation, and everyone here is looking for what are the newest trends in design and innovation. And I realized that all too often we see inclusive design as the new trend. We say it's the new future. But something I realized is that innovation has never happened in isolation. We're all familiar with that myth of the lone genius leaping out of the bathtub and going eureka. Like, innovation has always happened at intersections. It's happened when we've taken these different perspectives and we have brought them together and combined them. And so it stands that the more intersections that we create, the more opportunities for innovation there are, the more opportunities for growth that there can be. And when we bring them back together, that's where we end up creating this new sense of belonging, that the sum is much more greater. Now, inclusion has always been a key to innovation. That's something that really only occurred to me in writing of this talk. But if we want our innovations to really have the intended impact, we just need to be more conscious of who we include. Thank you.